So I thought I'd record this really quick tutorial because shout out Maya, she wants to help some deadlifts. Always happy to help. So I thought I'd break this down. Just finished training, but I thought I would just get it done now as opposed to later. So excuse the slightly sweaty looking homie. So breaking down a deadlift is a matter of understanding, first of all, the movement cues involved in the motion. So really it comes down to understanding firstly the muscles that you're looking to activate. So it starts up with our upper body, and you have this muscle called your latissimus dorsi, aka your lats. It's then going to come down to your hip flexors, which is more of a feeling as opposed to a muscle that you contract, even though it does have a muscular component in the hip flexor. Your hamstrings, your glutes, and I only loosely reference calves to refer to the ankle joint as opposed to actually the contraction of the calves, because you'll be using your ankles to drive them into the ground, which may offer a small sensation. So I'm going to break down the mechanical cues. It's a little bit similar to a squat, and the most important component in terms of back safety, which means to be the main complaint or challenge, it comes down to hip flexion. So if I'm going to use this stool as a prop to help signify hip flexion, and I'm going to predominantly take a side view just so you can see it. So when we're trying to perform a deadlift, the key thing that everybody's concerned about is protecting their lower back, and rightly so. If you perform this movement incorrectly, you'll place all the weight on your lower back and none of which on your hips, which is the biggest joint in the body in terms of load bearing. So in essence, when you're performing a deadlift, what you want to think first is, again, if you're picking up a barbell off the floor, it feels slightly different than when picking up some dumbbells or doing it with a resistance band. However, the first and most important thing to consider is the hinging. And again, I might have to tweak some distances. However, the first thing to consider is going to be the hinging of the hips. So we want to make sure that our hips are bent over in a hip hinge position. As you can see, my back is both neutral and straight. So the first thing to consider, and I'll use a single dumbbell to demonstrate because it is more universal in terms of its application to a barbell because it's a singular item. However, imagine this is on the floor, right, like a barbell would be. What you want to do is the starting position. You want to stand slightly wider than a shoulder width apart. I would consider this ankles together. I would consider this shoulder width because my shoulder, hip, and ankle are in one line. And then you could go slightly broader than shoulder width apart, but really that's more about your mobility and comfort. So from this position, I'm standing shoulder width apart. I slightly like to spray my ankles 20 degrees, similarly to a squat, and that's just more for my own hip mobility and gives me most range of motion when in the hip hinge. But for this, again, let's just go completely shoulder width apart. Nice and neutral, nice and straight, because that's how most people and you will probably be doing this. So what we're going to do is it first of all comes down to a starting position. You want to have your chest up, big inhale. You want to almost sit into your ankles like you're almost thinking this is a squat. And then you're picking up, you want to make sure that this bar is nice and close to you when you're picking it up. If it's really far, as you saw, right, I have to reach forward to pick it up. So you want to make sure it's nice and close so you can almost come down in a singular line as opposed to having to reach forward. So we're going to hip hinge, brace our knees, pick up the bar, elevate our chest, inhale, drive our heels into our ankles and pick it up. So you're now in the starting position, but again, if you're just picking up off an elevated surface, you can ignore that. And then the most important thing to do is you want to inhale, drive your hips back and allow this dumbbell barbell to drive down along your knees. And this is where you begin to realize I was standing too wide, or because you want to make, if you're standing too far, it will feel really unnatural. So you want to stand in a neutral position. Inhale, and you want this dumbbell to almost graze your knees. And then this is where you'll start to feel it in your calves based on your mobility. Inhale. And then you want to inhale and drive up. And I will show that to you again and I'll break it down. So hip hinge, right? Once the weight goes past your knees, you can actually drive your knees forward a little bit. Inhale. Drive until you squeeze your glutes at the top. You do not want to hyperextend. Just inhale, hip hinge, allow the weight to go past your knees. When it's gone past your knees, you can bend your knees, but then really inhale. And the only difference to compare here will be a Romanian deadlift or an RDL. When performing an RDL, or a stiff-legged deadlift, you're not aiming to bend your knees throughout the whole movement. So I'll show you from this view. You're keeping your knees with a very slight bend. Inhale. I also find it very helpful cue to tuck my chin into my chest. Right, and if you perform a conventional deadlift, you might just bend your knees with a much larger emphasis. Right, but again, if this was a barbell, right, you would have bumper plates, so then you would reach the ground much faster. The last thing to consider with this is the shoes that you're using. If you're using a traditional trainer, you may find that because you've got that additional raise of the bottom of the shoe, that's going to actually impair you a little bit in terms of your range of motion. So I like to use very flat shoes or take my shoes off when doing deadlifts. So those would be my cues and my breakdowns for doing a deadlift.